This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight now, we bring you a discussion on developments in Sri Lanka. The participants are Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist.
Armored personnel carriers have been patrolling the streets of Sri Lanka's major cities on Wednesday, while the nationwide curfew has been extended till Thursday to ensure that peace returns to the island nation. The country's defense secretary also clarified today that restoring peace was the government's primary responsibility. The armed forces have also barricaded President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's residence to prevent any protests from turning violent. Sri Lankans, facing their worst economic crisis ever, with shortages of fuel and food mounting, have been protesting against the president and his family members in key positions in government. They blame the government for mishandling the economic crisis and allowing the country to reach the stage that it has. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned and the Sri Lankan National Assembly is due to meet on May 17th. Ambassador Nirupama Rao, what is happening now in Sri Lanka? It's extremely disturbing to see images of violence emanating from that country.
Those of us who have lived in Sri Lanka and who love that country, it is most disturbing to see the turn of events, the very dramatic turn of events in that country, and more importantly, the suffering of the ordinary people. What we've witnessed is a literal collapse of state functions, as well as the economy is in an extremely parlous, critical state, I would say. And above all, the ordinary people of Sri Lanka, I'm not talking about the wealthy people or the elite people who are resident in the upscale residential districts of Colombo. I'm talking about the ordinary people spread across the country. They are really hurting and they are really suffering, and that should be a matter of concern to India, which is really Sri Lanka's only neighbor. Between us, there is really no zone of separation except the fact that we are two different countries.
How did the peaceful protests that started over a month ago, how did these suddenly turn violent?
Well, the people have been protesting for over a month now against the government. They have focused on the lack of good governance in the country, the very high scale of corruption. Corruption, by any definition, cannot be tolerated. But in Sri Lanka, in the last few years, it seems to have exceeded all bounds and confines, literally. And this has been a verdict, literally, the people's protest has been a verdict against the Rajapaksa regime, the dynasty as some people call it. And what is today in question is the legitimacy, the credibility of the staying power of popularly elected government. Sri Lanka is the region's oldest democracy in many ways and by every definition. But today, constitution of that country stands there, but the fact is that the state and the parliament has been unable to function. They've not been able to come up with an alternative to the crisis to see how peace can be restored, how stability can come back, and more importantly, the legitimacy of the Rajapaksa regime and their record of governance has been questioned on the streets of Sri Lanka.
Why is it that Gotabaya Rajapaksa does not accept the need to sort of step away and install somebody else in his place to try and get things going again? Because from the way things are going, it seems to me that the emphasis is more on political settlement rather than on handling the economic crisis, which is the root cause of the problem.
I would agree with you on that. I think the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the family has made some efforts to see how to diffuse the crisis by creating some joint front with the opposition. Obviously, the opposition MPs and parties are not willing to come in at a stage when nobody wants to share the blame for what has happened. Everybody quite would logically accuses the Rajapaksas for all the mishaps that have happened, all the mistakes that have happened, and the crisis that confronts the country. And nobody wants really to bail them out. And I suppose in the language of politics and in the way politics functions in much of our region, the opposition is not going to collaborate, even though this is a moment of national crisis. Everybody in the country at this moment, most people in the country, apart from the supporters of the Rajapaksa family, are crying for them, for the Rajapaksas to leave their positions, to step down. This essentially spells the political demise of that family, I believe.
Quite incredible when you think about it. I mean, barely just over 2 years ago, Gotabaya Rajapaksa came in with this huge majority, playing on all of the majoritarian tendencies, the Buddhist chauvinism, the anti-terror, the defense security kind of aspects of what they had achieved against the LTTE. And for it to have unraveled this fast is actually quite strange, even alarming in certain ways.
When Mahinda Rajapaksa became Prime Minister in 2005, he came in at an inflection point in the country's history. The ceasefire with the LTTE was collapsing, and then the civil war recommenced in many ways around that time, and he took it upon himself to deal with the LTTE, to defeat them, and he emerged really as the victor in that civil war, kind of a new Datta Gamanu, who is supposed to be the king who vanquished the Cholas in the old days. So it was the Mahavamsa being retold all over again in many ways. And but unfortunately for the country, I think the tragedy is that the transformative moment that the end of the civil war should have provided to the country in terms of reconciliation, bringing both communities together, was not really taken advantage of. And that really, 2009 was the year in which I believe if that transformative moment had occurred, the country would really never have looked back. It has so much going for it, Sri Lanka. There is so much potential, but it's tale of paradise lost, Nilover. And after that, I think you had, of course, an interregnum where you had a non-Rajapaksa regime with Ranil Wickremesinghe and Maithripala Sirisena and others bringing a government of a different color to the country. But even they were really not able to solve the problems. The economy was deteriorating. And then, of course, during Easter 2019, you had the ISIS bombings all across the country with very large casualties. It was a clear case of terrorism striking in a different form. Certainly it was terrorism unmitigated and unadulterated. And then a collapse of tourism. Then you had the pandemic. And then you had President Rajapaksa's very ill thought out, misconceived schemes like banning the import of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, introducing organic fertilizers, reducing taxes at a time, when there was no money in the country, and the collapse of the agricultural sector, the collapse of the tea industry, which is so important for Sri Lanka and its exports. And of course, tourism really did not pick up because of the pandemic. So it was a perfect storm in many ways that Sri Lanka was caught in. And you're seeing the after effects of that now. A case of some natural and unnatural disasters and then just bad governance.
India yesterday was very quick, MEA, to bring out a statement saying that India stood completely with the people of Sri Lanka and their democratic aspirations. Despite that, there seems to be a lot of negative sort of sentiments about India on social media, certainly, with people suggesting that Rajapaksas have taken refuge in India and so on. What should India do at this point of time?
I think India should look over the heads of these people. You will always encounter this kind of anti-India sentiment within the more elite sections of the population, what you call the Colombo 7 and Colombo 3 circles in Sri Lanka. You have to look over the heads of these people, and whatever you do in terms of your diplomacy and in terms of the workings of your foreign policy, really reach out to the people at this time of grave want and difficulty for them. In many ways, I think Sri Lanka's tragedy is that the connectivity with India, despite history, despite geography, despite religion, despite ethnicity, has really not been cemented in the last few decades. Ranil Wickremesinghe was, I think, the only Sri Lankan leader who really thought in those strategic terms of how Sri Lanka and India could be more closely linked together. You know, peninsular India, southern India is a natural hinterland for Sri Lanka. You should be thinking of, just as the United Kingdom is connected to Europe through, these undersea tunnels, through bridges. You need that kind of road, rail connectivity, sea connectivity between Sri Lanka and India so that the economy of Sri Lanka can prosper, so that its people, have that, can really look at horizons in the future that enable them to have a more prosperous standard of living, more opportunities, more livelihoods. And essentially, connectivity is the word. The C word is so important between India and Sri Lanka. And never mind what the social media is saying, never mind all the false news and the alternative realities that are thought to be created by, these sections that have always, I believe, thrived in this kind of industry of trying to raise questions, let me say, diplomatically about India. I mean, you will always have to deal with that in Sri Lanka. But let me just say, my approach, if I had a say in policy making, would be to deal directly with the people of Sri Lanka in order to mitigate their problems, the suffering that they are faced with, especially about 15% population of the country, at least 15% of 22 million, I think, are wanting today. They are in dire straits. And, after the Civil War, the Indian housing program, we built 50,000 houses over 5 years in the districts of the north and the east of the country and in the hill country. And we provided houses, livelihoods, businesses, and that's the kind of approach we need to follow today. And I think it may not be a bad idea for the government of India to consider how we can support the people, perhaps through helping in the public distribution program, a direct work guarantee, food for work program on the model of Manrega in India, where we provide, 120 days or 10 days a month of work guaranteed for a member of every family, and 70% of that aid being in food, which can be partly procured in Sri Lanka and partly in India, and together with kerosene and what poor families need. The balance 30% can be in cash. Maybe we should be thinking of schemes like that. Because anyway, Sri Lankans, as I wrote recently in a piece I did for one of our journals, they're like family, they're so closely connected to us. And I think we should be thinking of a people-oriented diplomacy, a people-oriented support at this time, because obviously we cannot interfere in the politics of the country. That is only going to, it's not going to work to our benefit, I feel, given the history of Sri Lankan politics. But I think the people would very much appreciate our support at this time.
But how can Indian government or how can India actually provide people-centric schemes without the government being involved? How can that?
We will, like we did for the housing program, we worked through the United Nations. And similarly, a program like this, we can work through the World Food Program, for instance, USP. We have to think of innovative approaches, Of course, I agree with you. Working through the government of Sri Lanka at this time, when the word government of Sri Lanka, when you mention it to the people, I think they see red and raises Cain among them. So yes, you'll have to have a very imaginative, creative approach, but all the while keeping the people's interests in focus.
Thank you so very much, Nirupama, for all of your insights, and hopefully things begin to calm down in Sri Lanka.
I certainly hope so. Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on developments in Sri Lanka. The participants were Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.